Hi, I'm Sean Dunn, and welcome to Origin to Ambition, the entrepreneur's journey. This episode, I speak with Cameron Schwab, owner and founder of Design CEO. Design CEO delivers leadership training for high-performing individuals and organisations. Anyone who's been around Australian rules football in Melbourne especially, but throughout Australia, will know that Cameron Schwab was the former CEO of the Richmond Football Club, the Melbourne Football Club and the Fremantle Football Club. So he brings a lot of high-level executive experience to this conversation and organisation capabilities. He's got a lot to offer in this episode, and I think you'll find it incredibly interesting, some of the approaches that he takes towards leadership and how you might be able to take something away from this and bring it to your business or entrepreneurial journey for yourself. So I invite you to please enjoy this episode of Origin to Ambition. Welcome to Origin to Ambition, the show where we explore the small business entrepreneur's journey in business. I'm your host, Sean Dunn. Let's get into it. So, Cameron Schwab, I want to thank you very much for your time today and for coming on Origin to Ambition. I really appreciate you making the time.
No, it's a pleasure. I've enjoyed our conversations that we've had, and I think we come from a similar-ish but different sort of mindset when it comes to some of the things I know you're keen to talk about. So I look forward to exploring those differences, but perhaps crossing over a little bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. As I start all of these, would you do us the favour of just taking us through your background a bit? And I'm not going to presume people know your background. I think it's pretty obvious if you've been around the Australian rules football ecosystem, we may know who you are, but for those who are listening who don't, would you just take us through your background a little bit and just take us back in time before you went down the path of running your own shop?
Yeah. Well, my current business is, my current, I suppose I'd call it a business, but I don't actually think of it so much as that. But is basically an iteration of all those experiences in many ways, and so my current work is I coach leadership, to mostly CEOs and their teams, but whether it's one-to-one or one to a group. But all of that comes from a background. I was in professional sport for all of my working life, but pretty much grew up in it as well, which was in the AFL environment. My family were very much embedded in the game. From an uncle who umpired a grand final back in the 60s to my father, who was what they called the secretary in those days, and I think they should still be called the secretary. It's just title inflation. They're now called CEOs, but in many ways it's the same role. And he was at St Kilda, then he was at Richmond, so he was part of 4 premierships in his career, and then ended up being a very influential, as influential as probably anyone has been, to be honest, in the AFL era. He was the person who such initiatives as the national competition and drafting salary caps, those things of which are very much the pillars of the sport now, very much have his fingerprints on them. They're probably everywhere but nowhere at the same time, I'd say now, even all these years later. Had a cousin, Peter Schwab, who played in 3 Hawthorn premierships, missed one with suspension, and also went on and coached Hawthorn into finals, and has just recently been announced to be inducted into the AFL Hall of Fame. And a younger brother, Brendan, who's spent a lifetime in sport in a different area, in mostly in soccer, and recently received an Order of Australia through for his what he's achieved in mostly human rights as it relates to sport. And my background is that I started working in the game when I was 18 years of age, then found myself in as a recruiter and recruited players, and quite early in the piece went down my own pathway through leadership in sport, and I was the CEO of 3 AFL clubs over 25 years, which was Richmond, which was very much my club I grew up with, and Melbourne and Fremantle, and feel very fortunate to have had all of those experiences, although at different times I didn't feel fortunate in some of the moments that it gave me. But it's wonderful environment to grow and learn in, and it will always ask a lot of you. And different times I found perhaps it was asking just a little bit too much as well.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, fair enough too. Fair enough too. Well, thank you for that. Would you mind taking us through your current business? I do want to. You just made a comment about you don't see it as. Did you say not as a?
Not so much as a business, although it clearly has a profit model that it needs to survive. No, I think of it as it's coaching, and so. And I think probably even as a CEO in my last maybe 10 years as a CEO, I found myself, I often talk about this idea of first mountain, second mountain. The first mountain, I think for men, I think it's a bit earlier for women, but I think it's you reach a certain phase of your career where, you've got good enough at something through whatever efforts you've made and whatever thing you've had to bounce back from, whatever disappointments you've had, where you then perhaps got enough of the lessons and learnings from actually getting good at something, which now have a real value to those who are going through that phase, and some who have come through that phase as well, because I think we're always up for growth, we're always up for learning. And I think that the first phase of the getting good phase is about almost showing that you're a bit special at something, and often getting recognised as being a little bit special at it, and therefore opportunities come your way. Those opportunities continue to ask more of you, and you get and the growth which comes just from that. And I find around the sort of the mid 40s to mid 50s, a little transition happens where, firstly, you're no longer special because you've got to actually make room for the special people coming in behind you. That's a big part of it, and I'm sure there's some evolutionary reason for this, or it might be just me trying to retrofit some piece of thinking. But I think the first phase is almost like a knowledge phase, and the second phase is sort of the wisdom phase. And if you don't sort of transition into the wisdom phase, if you're not careful, you sort of spend your life, and I've seen it a lot in elite sport, hanging on to that sort of special, you're no longer special, and almost grieving what you once the status you may have once had. And so when I think about my business now, I think it's very much an extension of that. So I got to be a CEO for 25 years, which was a long time to be in that role. And each of the roles I had were very much turnaround scenarios. They were, coming into environments and clubs which were struggling to perform at that point, and sport, there's one major means by which we measure performance, and that's clearly the scoreboard and silverware. But there's lots of things which need to happen for that to in fact occur. And the clubs I was involved with were struggling, at a performance level, but also struggling in regard to profit models and building something which could sustain itself as well. That wasn't necessarily by design, by the way. I didn't see myself as being or wanting to be some form of specialist in that area. It's generally just where the opportunities were, because they were going through change. So often that change then meant they were looking at a leadership change as well. The challenge with that was that it was very difficult to see it all the way through. So I spent 25 years in the role, but never was part of a premiership as an example. I had certainly had great experiences, making finals and preliminary finals and that type of thing, but never got to see it all the way through. So the work I do now is very much, in some ways, it draws on the lessons and learnings. So it's a teaching oriented thing. It's very much mentoring. It's not advisory. I'm really clear on that. I don't advise leaders. I just share ideas, and I think there is a difference. I think I'd go to someone like yourself for advice, for instance, in regard to my financial scenario, and with an expectation that your expertise was such that that you would be able to look at my scenario and say, look, this is my advice here. Whereas I think leadership and recognizing that the context of any leader inside their business is going to be so different that if you share thinking and you share ideas, models, story, mostly story, I'd say, then bringing it back to ideas which will hopefully, if nothing else, help them move towards something instead of away from something. They have to give definition to what that something is. And so I do that mostly with CEOs, and really and I love the concept, and a good friend, Cody Royal's written a book, A Second Set of Eyes. I think very much I become the second set of eyes for leaders or CEOs who struggle to find that. Everyone talks about the loneliness of the role, but again, that doesn't mean you need to be alone. But it's really hard to know where to go to get that sort of support. So the business is called Design CEO. The core of it's coaching of CEOs and their teams, but it's very much coaching a system of leadership. So when I set out the business, and I've still got the sort of sticky note here, and it literally still sits on my desk all these years. I don't know if I can quite get that, but it basically says build and coach a leadership system that is equal to the challenge of leadership. That was the goal right from the very start. Underpinned by two ideas, which the first one, which I got from Seth Godin actually, the first one was creativity, because that's a big part of my energy system, and the second one was humanity. It's a human-based approach to leadership. It's more of a power to you approach rather than a power over you approach. I'm not saying one's better than the other. I just know the one that worked for me much better than I would find it very difficult to be a power over you leader. But I know there's a lot of very successful leaders who do take that approach. So no judgment in that. So very much that, and that's why I don't think, because it's a natural extension of who I am in so many ways, or who I've become, and I get to articulate it through, because I do art, I do a lot of writing and those sorts of things. I don't necessarily think of it as something separate. I think it's very much, an extension of who I am in an emotional and also probably a practical sense as well.
Yeah, so there is a theme that seems to emerge in these discussions that I have where many, I call them small business entrepreneurs. So I'm going to suggest that you're the same, even though you don't see it as a business.
No, it's definitely it has to tick those boxes, doesn't it? Yeah, but
otherwise it's not viable, right? So,
no.
So and then you won't be there for your clients that you're helping, but it does come through oftentimes that it is a natural progression into running a business, because somebody takes a skill set or a passion, or both if you're lucky, I suppose, and sort of parlays that into offering it as a value add service to people that could do with the help, so to speak, or do with the product if you're a product based business, So for you, you've sort of basically just said that's it was sort of a natural progression. But was there a specific point in time, I suppose, where you said, I have to do this. This is the pivot moment where Design CEO has to be born, if you know.
Yeah, I think there was. It was my last role. I was CEO of Melbourne, and it's an interesting thing, because it would probably be seen now as it was a really challenging period in lots of ways. Like it was almost I think like anyone who's going through any difficult period, it's always amplified when you're the person going through it, clearly. But it was a period of time where the club was really struggling. We were at the end of the queue in regard to some of the more important things that football clubs needed, and trying to scratch our way through, and then had to deal with, the person who brought me back into the club was a fellow by the name of Jim Steins, who just iconic figure in our game, and was really in many ways the attraction for me to take the role in the first place. And then it was only 6 months later he got diagnosed with cancer, and he passed away 3 years later. And it was only recently that Melbourne had their annual game, and they had a terrific victory, which was great. And so his legacy very much lives on, both within the club, but also, in his charity reach. So there was a real sense that we had something going for us and we could work through. But then that created a really complex leadership scenario where you're in support of Jim and his battles, but we're still running a footy club. We still had to do that. We had a number of just challenging, issues we had to deal with. Did we deal with them well? Did we deal with them appropriately? Well, there's obviously growth and learning in all of those things. And then 4 or 5 years later, about 5 years later, it was quite unexpected, but I got the sack as CEO of the club, and whilst I always know that possibility's there, I really didn't see that it was going to happen. But I was actually prepared for it to happen, probably. Not because of any particular sophisticated thinking, but a recognition that, one, the game is capable of producing that, and two, that I'll be okay if it does happen. I think it was that sort of mindset, in some ways, that it's way bigger than any person who's involved. I'm really happy with the legacy piece, which, a number of things which came out of it. Women's football, the club was able to set itself up financially probably forever. It's now got, $25 million to $30 million of assets it didn't have when we started. And so all those things really positive. And then won a premiership, which is something that it hadn't done for 57 years. So I think there was some residual, and the list management team, which collected that a player's good enough to win a premiership, was put in place during my time at the club. So from that perspective, it was all right, but I really had no idea what it would actually look like. The one thing I did know is that I didn't want to just go and be a CEO of anything else. I never had that energy around that. Even with causes that are really important to me. Like, for instance, I've had prostate cancer, and I thought, well, why don't I try and get involved? Can I be a CEO of a cancer a cancer charity? And then there was part of me saying, I'm happy to talk to people about it, but I don't want to talk about it every day of my life. I don't want that to be the thing. And there's some wonderful work already happening in those areas. And then what would happen, I actually went and studied fine art for a couple of years. And so I went from being in boardrooms in footy clubs to, at the Victorian College of the Arts with a whole lot of, 18-year-old first-year uni students. I didn't do uni when I first left school, but I always liked drawing. And so I got in and was able to do that. And then over time, people would just give you a buzz. Oh, would you mind catching up? Or would you like to speak at this event? Or would you do that? And I started to get just a little bit of my mojo back, realizing that there was an interest in my little piece of, I suppose, insight. That was probably it. And
sorry, can I just jump in, Cam? Sorry.
Yeah.
So you found that the art gave you your mojo back, so to speak. Like,
very much.
Doing that passion project, I suppose, for want of a better term, but that sort of really invigorated you. Just more broadly, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, it did. It did. It's a very different world. I think the courage of artists is really underestimated. First of all, there's nothing more intimidating. I used to think, standing in front of a board delivering bad news was an intimidating thing. But there's sort of like there's a conversation we have to have, and we have it. But I don't think there's anything more intimidating for an artist than a blank canvas, for example. And then you create something, and art is really very much about, I think for most people anyway, it's about the conversation that it starts in many ways. It's not, and there's a and it was interesting because I had a wonderful lecturer by the name of Raf Ishak, who was, and because I was older, I sort of got on more. I spent more time probably with the lecturers and all that. I was almost like a tribal elder at there, and I don't think they quite knew what to make of me, and I wouldn't have known what to make of me either. There was a few other mature age, and they're great people, but I remember him coming to me and he said, "Oh, can we have a chat?" And my experience is any conversation which starts with "Can we have a chat?" normally, at any level of my life, whether it's with my wife, whether it's in work, whether it's anything, generally there's something going to be coming your way. And he said, look, my take is I think you do art like a CEO. It was what he said to me. And it was certainly his interpretation of what a CEO does, but it was very much my interpretation of what an artist does. Because what I think, and I've had conversations with him since, he was saying that you're only presenting your art with an outcome in mind, which is the outcome that you're seeking. That you're producing art that you want people only to think of your art in a certain way. And it was a wonderful message that, because I knew that my best leadership, my best CEOing, if you like, was where I had created conditions where there was space for good people to step into. Probably the worst was when I created space for bad people to step into. That's a different conversation, but because it's not just the creating of space, it's creating space with a view of, that there's a quality that can step into that. And so with my art, I was basically doing the same thing. I was just closing it out. So if I produced something and I showed it to you, the only thing I wanted you to think about it was what my intention was in actually producing it. Whereas, and what I learnt from actually studying art was that if we would go into the National Gallery and there'd be 3 groups of, say, 10 young people, and they're very different thinkers, people who are studying fine in the main. The best artists are still very systematic and very structured and all of those sorts of things. And we'd go, say, in front of a Brett Whiteley painting at the National Gallery, and we'd break into 3 groups, and we'd spend 3 hours on one painting. And then we'd all come together at various times and talk about what conversations we had, what had we seen, and the 3 groups had seen something totally different in them. There'd be a little bit of crossover, but majorly different perspectives on it. And so there's a wonderful courage in that that I often think about now, how people will interpret art from 200, 300 years ago, where they would have no context of what the artist was actually thinking, but they'll find meaning in it. The same way as you and I can find meaning in music, which could be quite different depending on the context of our life at the time. So he's that space making and those sorts of things. Well, that really just for me, then I just changed the way I did art, and so for me that was just a wonderful form of coaching and a wonderful form of teaching, and then really was there a way of which you could express, So really, I think of my business as being just a centimetre wide and hopefully really, really deep, and it just goes out to the world in such a way where the people who would relate to my centimetre or would need the centimetre that I provide as it works for them would have an interest in the work I'm doing. And so really, I don't think I would have come to that realisation had I not have studied art, that it's just actually finding and then allowing others just to interpret its value for them, and having the confidence that that's okay.
Sean Dunn here, and thank you for watching this episode of Origin to Ambition, the Entrepreneur's Journey. I'm a financial advisor who specialises in working with small business entrepreneurs and high-income earning executives. We analyse cash flow, build assets, and protect those assets to help our clients do what they want, when they want, with the people that they want to do it with. So if that's of interest to you, head over to our website and book an initial discovery call, and I'd look forward to speaking with you. Yeah. What I find interesting, what you've just said, is I'm not surprised by it, but I find it interesting. And I think that this is another thing so when a new prospective client comes to me, one of the questions I do ask these days, I never used to ask when I started, I probably didn't have the courage, Cam, to be honest, but now I ask them if they're coachable. Yeah. And I appreciate that coachability can mean slightly different things to different people, of course, but I do ask if people are coachable. And when I say coachable, I mean, are you open-minded enough to push yourself into an area that might be a little bit uncomfortable? And to be a bit cliched, growth comes from challenges, and adversity. So what I just found interesting in what you just said was that you had an art professor kind of challenge your thinking, but your success from that is that you're looking to grow. So when we talk about growth mindset, and again, that's probably throwing a few cliches around here, but that growth mindset that you've got, really, changed your outlook there and gave you your mojo in a sense, in a indirect way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. So I'm 62 now, so I often think about if there was one thing and one thing only, which is going to keep you, I don't stay young. I've got no interest in staying young, but, staying vibrant, energized or whatever it might be. There's something around, one of my favorite quotes, it takes curiosity to learn, it takes courage to unlearn. It takes curiosity to learn, it takes courage to unlearn. So the curiosity piece is almost the starting point, where do I have a curiosity about art? The interesting thing about art is I probably realised I couldn't do it full time, at least at that point in life. Yeah. There were still other things which I wanted to do, but I have an art practice now. I try and produce something which is probably a little bit different. It's not so much a piece of art; it's more an illustrative take on something which happens in a game of footy. My art actually started off was when I was a young fellow. I loved superheroes, and so I used to draw, your Batmans and Supermans, and then the footballers became my superheroes. So I'd draw, footballers taking impossible marks, and there was, because they were big and they were talented and they were athletic, and they sort of looked a little bit like superheroes, in that sense. Yeah. And so my art is really quite comic book oriented even to this day. And so I try to pick a moment of the match from every round of footy, which gives me an opportunity to use the moment, illustrate the moment with a drawing, and I just draw my interpretation of something, but with a piece of writing which actually comes with it. And it's an interesting thing that
sorry to break you mid-stride there, but can I encourage any listeners to follow you on LinkedIn to see your art? Because I absolutely like just about every piece you ever put up there. So
who do you barrack for again? Who's your team?
I'm a blue bagger.
Oh yeah, well we haven't. It's actually a blue bag. It's actually a blue bagger one coming out. So about the young fellow who missed the goal, Taylor, on the weekend. So
okay, that's an interesting story. Another time, but I'll keep my eyes open for that one. So I encourage anyone to follow you on LinkedIn to get a dose of art.
Yeah, well, these again.
Sorry, Cam.
No, that's okay. So it's more sort of an illustrative, but really, it's the story that I'm looking at, and
absolutely
in regard to. So that's the other thing which came out of art, and I was always a storyteller, and there was a natural element to that, and I grew up very, very, very much, very, very much with stories. But just to be able to have that curiosity, I think that's the thing which keeps you energized. So. Yeah, it's like in job interviews. First question I always used to ask is, what's the best thing you've ever taught yourself? What's the best thing you've ever taught yourself? And what you're trying to do is find out whether people can drive their own growth, they can drive their own learning. And the other thing is when they, it sets them back a little bit. So there's a little bit of having to deal with a bit of the tension of the question as well, because it's not your obvious question that you ask. But when they actually find the thing, you'll know if the person's eyes light up, when they tell the story of something, that generally there was curiosity and courage embedded in the process of learning, because the chances are that they went down a track, they had to learn something, they had to find something out, they would have made a mistake, they would have had to bounce back, all the sorts of things which growth, as you mentioned, the discomfort of growth will actually ask of you. And you'll know, Alan Jeans, who was a great mentor of mine, the great Hawthorn coach, he said, you can't put in what God took out, that there is a certain mindset that individuals actually have when it comes to that. But you actually get to see the best part of them as well. It's so much, because the job that you're actually asking them to do, the chances are it's going to change and evolve and grow. Well, it's almost certain that it's going to change and evolve and grow if they're going to be anything for you over any extended period of time. So therefore, you're wanting them to be able to be self-directed learners. You're not wanting them to be having to knock on your door or walk into your office every time there's something, that's part of it. And then the next question is, what's the next thing that you're really keen to learn about? And again, your eyes will light up. It's something which means enough to them that they're prepared to allocate whatever that thing's then going to ask of them. And it can be anything. It really can be anything. It doesn't matter. And so the curiosity piece, and I'm with you. So the first question, before I coach someone, I'm happy to go through a little framing of this if you like, because I think it relates to even organisations because I think there's such a thing. I
was just going to say, Cam, if you wouldn't mind that, because what I'm thinking about is people listening to this who are running a business. They might be small business operators or entrepreneurs, and that they might be listening to this and thinking, it's not even about what they are doing. It's about they might be trying to build a team. So, trying to build a team, and I think that framework, if you wouldn't mind sharing that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So part of it is, I think there's such a thing as organisational coachability as well. And look, obviously that extends from the coachability of the individuals. There'd be some weird mathematical formula that we could come up with, which would be something about the dynamic of the group, which we in sport we talk about mechanics and dynamics a lot. So the mechanics of the organisation are set up for learning, but the dynamic of the group is that they have an appetite for it, and even the conversations they're prepared to have is that they're much more focused on best idea and not their idea, although they have to be prepared to bring their idea in order to get to best idea, which is a piece of thinking from Rick Rubin, the music producer, works with some of the biggest acts in the world. But he's going to work with the band. He says, I expect you to bring your idea into the studio with a view that it helps us get to best idea, knowing that, even as a leader, you only ever bring, one set of eyes, one set of ears, but the most limiting thing that you bring is just one imagination into the room, even if it's one of the great imaginations, but it's still only yours in that sense. So the concept is organisational growth, but it actually comes down to leadership growth. So before I coach someone, the first question I ask is, are you up for growth? Are you up for growth? Not are you up for change? It's interesting, even reframing growth, change as growth within organisations is an interesting little contextual change, which I think is helpful. And so then the question we're really asking is, are you coachable? Are you coachable? Are you up for growth? The next question is, okay, are you up for change? Because the growth will ask you to change. That there's no doubt about that. And so the question then is, well, how do we make the change compelling for you? So it's the idea around compelling, which I think is important, because my take is all good strategy comes from a compelling story. Strategy for me needs to be two things, and this goes to your organisational growth idea, but all good strategy comes from a compelling story, and two, makes the best use of scarce resources. Well, the scarcest resource is the leadership time and energy inside it. It's the energy and attention of your key people with inside organisations. Often we think of it as a time money, but I think it's, they're obviously at an organisational level, they're your scarce resources, but for the people themselves, the currency is energy and attention. So we say, how do we make it compelling? Even if someone said, I want to get fit, I want to get healthy. Well, what is the most compelling means by which you can actually do that, is a critical one. Then the next question we ask is, are you up for feedback? Because the change needs to be informed by something. And the question we just simply ask there is, what is the world telling you? What is your world telling you? And our world is telling us a lot. There's a tendency to think of feedback as in you and I sitting down and me delivering you some form of feedback, but it's really an active practice, reflective practice where you're setting yourself up for feedback. As in, what are the signs? What are the signals? And one of the critical elements of the feedback process that we seek to develop is how people become aware of the things they're not thinking about, the blind spots. It's not when we do need to talk to weaknesses. Yes, that's part of it, but the blind spots piece is the key one. Is that limitation on our imagination is no doubt going to create blind spots for us, and so we set ourselves up. And the work I do is very much about how CEOs and leaders. No one tells a CEO their baby's ugly, so it's really hard for CEOs to get good quality feedback. But I take a leaf out of Chris Fagan, the Brisbane Lions coach, that he'll stand in front of his group for 3 or 4 times a year, and just all he's really wanting to know is how they're experiencing him and how different that is from his intention. So people don't experience our intentions, they experience our behaviours. So is there a gap between how they're experiencing his behaviours as to how so we need to be clear on what our intentions are, but then we need to be able to behave those intentions and therefore hopefully be experienced in that way as well. So this is part of the feedback piece. If you get feedback which says we don't like this and we do like that, that's not an obligation to change, because you may still think that you're going down that track for, it's not a democracy in that sense, but it's helpful.
The next and even that feedback loop is just more broadly useful in business anyway, because even if you're dealing with customers or clients or whatever, one of the biggest risks to a small business is a divergence in expectations.
expectations are critical, so it's really been really clear on expectations is fundamental.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Thank you for that. Thanks for sharing. I think that's
so just a couple more things just to finish it off with. So are you feedback? And then the next question is, are you up for action? Are you up for action from that feedback? And so there's no point the first three questions, growth, change, feedback, are mostly about getting an idea. There you got to actually do something with the idea. And so are you up for action? And the two questions we ask here is, what are you going to do? What trade-offs are you prepared to make? And how do you make it happen? What resistance do you now need to overcome? And because there's always a friction in any form of change. And the last piece is then, are you up for accountability, which is, which is the idea you've got to now deliver on the promise. And so we think of expectations, for example. I think of leadership. I think there's only one measurement that any organisation needs to have, and it's performance versus expectations. But we have to be really clear on what the expectations are, whether that's a scoreboard, whether that's a financial outcome, even having a series of values and principles and brands and all those things. They're just some form of expectation, and the role is to perform to those expectations. And if you perform to the expectations, you're fundamentally delivering on the promise. So so basically we're talking about growth, change, feedback, action, accountability in a circle, and they all sort of roll back to each other in regard to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So would you just one more point on that piece? Would you, when you talk about it being in a circle, do you sort of see that as a continuous spiral upwards? So in other words, if you
potentially, yeah, but
this level sort of thing and go again.
A little bit. No, I'd see sort of each of them folding back to each other. So, for instance, if the question is, are you up for feedback? And then you say, are you up for action? Then you action it. The action, it actually gives you more feedback. Yeah. So you then go, well, I'm back to feedback stage again. So because the one thing we're talking about is, and I try to differentiate between, particularly for leaders, and I know there's leaders who will listen to this, is I try to differentiate between what I call a complicated issue and a complex issue. So a complicated issue mostly should be solved at the level where there's the most expertise and understanding. That good logic, good thinking should produce an outcome which fixes the problem, if you like. Yeah. A complex issue is the most the ambiguous, nuanced. There's probably no right answer. They're the ones that they've probably been down somewhere deep in the organisation and percolated their way back up to you, and by the time they've got to you, it's got hair all over it. Really, it's just messy, it's rotten, and there's probably no right answer. And so and if there was, and because you're operating with very much imperfect information and at that stage, and it's most likely to be an issue of dynamics rather than mechanics. People aren't working well together, or something. Someone's disappointed with an outcome. And it hasn't worked well. Well, it's just a question often of just taking it forward. And even in your efforts to take it forward, you might make it worse, but at least you then get more, you've got more knowledge and understanding. The formula, situation happens times response equals outcome. So really, you can't change what's happened, but you can be judged by how you respond to what happened.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. I want to go back to the start of Design CEO, if that's all right.
Yeah, no worries.
What it was like. What was it like when you first kicked off Design CEO? And what were your challenges? Like anyone?
Well, it was probably I probably had 2 or 3 sort of half goes at it first. Before it, a little bit like I'm talking about, because then more feedback came back. I thought, this is what I'll do. I'll go and do this work, and it'll be great. And then I started doing work I didn't like with people I didn't like working. Not the people I didn't like working with, but they weren't. It was just not my thing. It was more, I'd become an advisor, I think, rather than a coach. I reckon that was probably what happened. And then about a little bit down the track, then even the idea of designing something for CEOs, that's hence the name. So it was even the phase of the business, the first, when I worked at a strategy level as a CEO, I used to try to phase it over 4 phases. The first phase, and it's the phase, yes, on time, but phase on insight and understanding and when you're ready to take the next step. The first phase was just called the right to play. can I create something which just gets enough of a foothold that it starts to produce, the kind of work that I'll really enjoy doing? Because I saw it as, this is what I'll do from now on type framing of it. There was probably always a little bit of an appetite if a good CEO role was made available to me, but that it seemed relatively quick that door had closed for me. So the first idea was just the right to play, and I reckon it was about 3 years where there was just enough happening. I started working with some really good quality CEOs. I started doing some work with the teams. The IP and the stuff they were really interested in was becoming more available. I was then getting enough feedback from the coaching and the teaching then to inform what the next layer of it was. I tried to write as often as I could because I found that helped. That was really a sort of sense-making aspect of the process. And I think it was about 3 years, I reckon. And and then the next phase, I just call it in the game. We're sort of in the game now. It's like, so it's half time in a game of footy. You just want to be in the game. And my phase I'm in at the moment, I'm just about to kick into it, is what I call the Premiership quarter. It's like the third quarter in a game where, so the first phase is about the right to play is about creating. I think the second phase is then a little bit about control, bringing a bit of control back into the group, so it can actually, so you're not having to make everything up every time you do something, that you build it once and sort of sell it off and type mindset.
Yes.
And then the third phase, the Premiership quarter, is more of a challenge phase where I'm going back and challenging some of the ideas and thinking, and, do I want to push hard for more growth, or I'm, it's really just as much as anything, just working out, what I think that then looks like. And then the final phase, if I get into that phase, if I survive the Premiership quarter, is I call it a game never won, which is this idea of, the infinite game, that maybe, that you never stop growing, you never stop learning, you never stop, I'm using tools and resources now to do the work I do that, they weren't even, no one had even invented them, when I started out, and even recently started using Claude Co-work, and I'm thinking, this could help, this could help. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's, that's been a game changer as well, but that's probably a whole different episode, isn't it? That we could, talk about. What's probably been if you could, it's probably hard to nail it down to one or two, but different to working in an organisation for somebody else and working for yourself, what's probably been the biggest, the one standout learning or lesson that you've had when you kicked off Design CEO and since?
That if you're inside an organisation, whilst there's always going to be an expression of who you are through your leadership, it's not a full expression. Particularly the roles I played. Like as CEO of the Melbourne Footy Club, you were CEO of a footy club which invented the game. So its history went all the way back to 1858, and actually the very first secretary, as I mentioned before, as they were called, was a guy by the name of Tom Wills, who wrote the first rules of the game. So in effect, you're sitting in the same metaphoric seat as the person, and it's the only sporting club in the world which can claim that, that it's still playing the game that it invented. So that means that you have to be you have to adjust to that. Like for instance, we came up with, when I was CEO there, we talked about trademarks and brands and all that. Well, for Melbourne, it was the idea was first and forever, and not many people can say that. So there was the first element of it, but it's a forever thing. And so what came from that was that was actually then gave us the courage, for example, to be the first club to have a women's team. And then we just had to find someone to play us, and that was an exhibition game. And 4 years later, there's a women's national comp. So that lovely legacy in that. But it was very much about operating within operating within sort of the guardrails of that, And at different times, Melbourne's tried to operate outside of those guardrails, and for me, it then meant that it was a diluted version of what it made it special. But I also understand why people tried to do that, because the constraints are so constraining. The goal is to find gold within the constraints. That's from your constraints come your opportunities. What stands in the way becomes the way sort of mindset. Whereas when you're running your own business, you got none of those constraints. But that is in fact the biggest danger is that you've actually you got to go out and produce the constraint. You got to work out what constraints am I going to create for myself here. I remember when I first set the business up that I thought, there was my favourite racehorse when I was a kid wore the colours blue and pink. I thought I'm going to make it blue and pink, and then about 6 months later, I go, I don't like my colours. But what are the colours I've always loved? Black and yellow. So why? So because the old Tigers when I was a kid, so my business colours are black and yellow. And that constraint now, I've stayed within that, whereas there'd be nothing in me, I could turn it orange and purple if I wanted to. But, and the only person who probably notice is me in that sense. But just to have clarity around what, I think there's 4 models any business needs. It's sort of like what I call the us model, what makes us, which is sort of purpose, strategy, purpose, identity, culture type stuff. Then it needs to produce a performance model, which is, people, systems and strategy. Then it needs to produce a profit model, customer, brand, relationships, and then a growth model, which is about learnings, new ideas, community, those things. But when you're starting a business, it has to start at the profit model level and then work the other stuff back a little bit. So I realised over time, I've got a profit model. People are prepared to pay me an amount of money of which I can make a margin on, of which actually can keep the lights on. And then from there backfilled what I wanted all the other things to actually be. But at that point, I see, say, for instance, people starting up, they get the profit model not too bad, but then they're not then prepared to produce the constraints of which they now need to operate within because it feels too constraining. And every part of our body pushes against that, our mind and body pushes against that. So that was the biggest thing, that I had to produce my own guardrails. I had to produce that, and I made them really tight. And I'll often say to people, I'm not your person. If you want me to be that, I'm not your person, but I know some people who are, or might be that for you. And that's sort of, and even being clear on what my principles are. Like my principles of my business, as I said, built on this idea of creativity and humanity. But I went back to the G because I love the MCG was such an important part of me. So 4 G's, it's grateful, it's goodness, it's generosity, and it's grouse. They're my 4 words, Yeah. So the grateful, I'm grateful for the opportunity to do this work with you. I'm grateful for the opportunity of being on this podcast. Generous, I will be generous with myself. We will be generous. We won't be cheap, but we will be generous. Goodness, it's going to come from a good part of us, which is the power to you, not the power over you mindset. Yeah. And grouse for me just captures, I want it to be really good quality. I want you to have a really good experience of whatever the thing is that we're trying to do. And I think anyone who grew up in Melbourne would know the word grouse. It has almost you can't sort of explain it, but it's sort of a mix of cool and ace and goodness knows what. I'm sure there's a word far more contemporary than the ones I'm using now. But,
it's one of those culture. It's not really necessarily. It's a cultural term that, when you're from the culture, you get it, and sometimes not in part of it. But
But it's good to even have to explain it a bit, And people, every time I say it, everyone smiles. Yeah, grouse. Yeah, exactly. And it was very much, I grew up in Mount Waverley, which was an outer suburb, and mate, it was grouse. Yeah.
It was exactly the same. So you just touched on something. I was going to move on for a second, but I want to circle back to something you just said, and you touched on that when a person sets out on the journey of starting a small business. And one of the things I'm not suggesting I coined this phrase by any stretch of the imagination, but sometimes in the enthusiasm to start something or follow a passion, whatever it might be, sometimes the small business or the potential small business entrepreneur doesn't understand the rules of the game.
Yeah.
So they they sort of launch themselves at something and don't necessarily take account of what the rules of the game. And the rules of the game might be different for every person, But I think that touches a little bit on. I'm not trying to backwards engineer what I've just said, but I think it touches a little bit on that constraint that you talked about. Sort of setting up your parameters and setting up your what field am I, what sort of playing field, sorry, sporting analogy, am I playing on, rather than just sort of blindly rolling off. And look, a lot of people have started businesses and maybe worked that out in real time as they've gone along. But so that's sort of touching on what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, very much. And you create your own currency around this. So, like, for example, a critical currency for me was, what conversations do I want to have? So what sort of things do I want to talk about? So if you are bored in the conversation, or you're having conversations you do not enjoy having, where you're not leaning forward and your eyes are lighting up and you're not, so for instance, coaching, as you know, you learn as much as what you do when you're coaching as what you get. So if I'm not having that sort of conversation, for me, I'd really struggle to have the energy to do the thing that the work is actually going to ask of me. The same reason I talked about, I didn't ever want to be a CEO of anything else other than an AFL club. I've just had no interest in that whatsoever. Because I knew how much the job asks of you, and unless I had that full on, passion's the word you use, but I don't think I see it as, for me, I think I fell in love with the game before I fell in love with anything else. It just was. Yeah, and people would say, even in the role that I played, they'd come and see, so I've got a great passion for the game. And I go, how many games did you watch on the weekend? Oh, I watch the Tigers play, or I watch the Blues play. I go, mate, the people who've got a passion for the game here, mate, they watch every game. If you want to compete at that level with people operating inside this organisation, they've become, that inch wide and mile deep, at some stage in their life. And it was interesting, even, I remember as a kid watching World of Sport on the telly, and Kevin Sheedy was described by Jack Dyer and Lou Richards as a student of the game. And I'm going back a long time. And I was just a young fella, and I said, that's what I want to be. I want to be a student of the game. Yes. And I pretty much set myself to be that without any view that it was ever going to be a career in it. But I did have a little bit of a line of sight that there were people who did have careers in it. But I put my father on such a pedestal that and my family sort of separated when I was in my teenage years anyway. So I was finding my own way anyway in life. Yeah. But no view that it would ever be a career for me because of what they just wasn't big careers in the game. I'd go to work with him on the week during school holidays or whatever, and there's only one or two people hanging around the footy club for most of the day, and then all the players and that all turn up later in the day. So but that idea of is, if I said to someone who was entering into a business, what do you need to be a student of to be good at this job? And so my student of the game got me my opportunity, I think, in the end, and obviously a good surname and those things help. I worked with Ron Barassi. He suggested that I go into recruiting because I think he recognised my little bit of a student of the game mindset. And then over time I realised, no, I want to be a student of strategy. You'll probably even notice in the conversation, I go very much into strategic type thinking. That's my frames that I've always enjoyed. And as a recruiter, you had to be a bit like that because you're building a team for the future and what do we need now and what we will need in the future. And then over time I thought, no, you need the human performance piece to back up the strategy. And so what drives human performance? Well, leadership drives human performance. So I think I've gone through 3 or 4 phases of my studentship, if you like. Yeah. So, and then what I worked out is if I want to run my own business, I've got to be a student of that. So I went and studied it. I joined a thing called Thought Leaders. It's a weird sort of name and whatever. It's not whatever, but it was outstanding because I had to work out how to turn this lived experience, which I thought potentially had something to offer, into a system whereby you could actually commercialize it in some shape or form, of which I had no experience. I did my MBAs, I did all those things, but we never talked about this stuff. And so it was some wonderful fellas, and I really recommend people who are interested in it to have a look at it, because it helped me codify what I learned into something which I could then potentially commercialize. And one of their lines is, work you love with people you love working with type mindset.
Yes.
And that's how it came about. And so it really was what do you need to get good at is a really important question. To do that work well, what do you need to get good at? Because if you can't get good at it because you lose interest in it, well, don't do it, because it's not going to hold you through those wake up in the morning and your first thoughts fuck moments, so that's not going to take you through that,
Yeah. Well, I was actually just going to ask you, what's the piece of advice you would give, the one piece of advice that you would give somebody looking to start up a business? I'm wondering whether you just sort of touched on it.
Can you get good at it? And so it's not advice, because I don't give advice, but it's the idea I'd share, But even, mate, the funny thing is, and you don't know what good necessarily looks like, but you do. There's a little danger in getting good, is that you do get caught up in comparisons and expectations, and that can produce a little bit of envy. And I think there's a natural element of that, because you're comparing your very much work in progress with someone else's very much finished piece of thinking in the concepts of it. But then when you even envy, which I think is one of the deadly sins, isn't it? I think it's up there. I'm just thinking of the Brad Pitt movie, 7. So I think envy gets a run.
I think it is one of them. I think it is.
Yeah. So where does the envy come from? Is actually, so if I'm envious about something, I go, is it about the identity or the purpose or what is it? But it's mostly, most of it comes down to not the who, the why, the identity, purpose, or the how, because we can get a system. It's, are you prepared to do what it will ask of you? What it will ask of you. And so often people go, look, I'm a cyclist, and every year there's this great ride called Three Peaks. Everyone goes out there. They're crazy hard. People take between 9 and 15 hours to do it. And I'm sort of fit enough to get on the bike most days, can do enough, in that sense, as one of those. I think I passed the mammal phase. I'm actually I'm past it, but I do get in the lycra and do all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And everyone says, "Oh, you're going to do 3 peaks," and it's become my sort of metaphor for exactly this conversation, because I go, I like the identity piece. Yeah, I'd love to say, I've done 3 peaks. Yes. The purpose, endurance events and all of that. There's really deep sense of training for an outcome and deep sense of purpose. So the who and the why, and the who and the why, I get that. And then the how, everyone goes into the how. I go, well, I reckon I could work out the system. There's a million people who've done it already. They'll teach me, coach me, and whether I do it well on the day, but the how, they have to train a certain amount of money. You have to get good at nutrition on the bike. There's a whole lot of things you have to learn. The big question is, am I prepared to do what it will take? Am I prepared to do the fact that I'm going to have to train for 7 hours each Saturday? Am I prepared to do everyone will talk about the who, the why. They'll often ask about the how. It always comes down to the what. Are you prepared to do what it will ask of you? And so what that then says to me is, how much do you want to do 3 peaks? Really? How much? And at this stage, I haven't. So, but does that make sense? In that way? Because like I love the fact I've built this little brand, and there's identity, there's purpose, and all that sort of stuff. But don't worry, there's times I go, wouldn't it be just good to have a salary coming in every month? Wouldn't it be good just to have you're not having to worry about doing my own tax? And wouldn't it be worried about, wouldn't it be good to worry about all this? I was used to having, 200 people in a footy club sort of doing most of the stuff that you had to do. Often I was the only person who could control my diary in the whole organisation. It was actually a bit of a weird thing, because I was making other people busy. Yeah,
absolutely. That feeds a little bit into a question that I do ask, and I won't talk about having an entrepreneurial mindset, because I think a lot of the things you've given this the treasure trove of thoughts around that, I think, just in this discussion. So I don't think that's the question. but I do ask all of my guests, is entrepreneurship for everyone?
I think your version of entrepreneurship can be for anyone. If it's, if it's the Elon Musk version of it, it's certainly not for me. Is it the person who sees a little opening in the world of which they can find that they can do the stuff that they're good at and they'll enjoy doing, and there's a commercial model in it? Well, I can't see why it's not for everyone. So it is it for me. Yeah, you do need to go tick the how, the who, the why, the how, but the big box you got to tick is the what. And for me, like, I know, I had this conversation. This is a true story. I won't tell the person's name, but it's a good story. He said he was long-term CEO, big business, went through a really challenging phase, navigated it beautifully, and all that sort of stuff. And he rang me up and said, "Oh, well, I just want to let you know that I've resigned and I'm going to move into whatever the next thing is." Oh, okay, cool, yeah, cool. We had a good chat. And what's the next thing? And he goes, "Well, I'm really fucked." He said, "I'm really tired. I'm really fucked." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, the way I read it is you've got two things. You go back into your CEO world, or you can look to build. You've got this unbelievable experience. You could do the sort of work I'm doing. You'd be great at coaching leaders, and you've learned so much." And he said, "Oh, and I've had a couple of phone calls from people looking for another CEO I'll go to those interviews and see what happens." I said, "I thought you said you were fucked." So what I'm saying from that is that either of them are going to ask a lot of you, So going and actually thinking, I don't know if I could, like, for instance, I don't know. I'm not sure, for example, I would have done what I've done if the phone had rung 3 months later and said, "Come and be the CEO of Carlton."
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would have done it.
Yeah.
And so I think you need to you've got to be clear on what it's going to ask of you, knowing that it's asking things of you that you probably don't fully understand, and most likely you would underestimate at the time, because we tend to be underestimators in that sense. Yeah,
I definitely did that when I started my business, Cameron. I was overly optimistic, I would suggest.
Yeah, yeah.
But
yeah. That's interesting, because I've just finished Neil Danaher's book, which is a ripper, The Power of Choice. I've got it behind me here. But he, there's a great, because I love two questions: what's possible, what's important. One, it's this idea of define reality, give hope. Define reality, what's important, what's possible, give hope. He's got a little thing in there about being the optimist and the pessimist. He said, because he grew up on a farm and one of 11 kids, and he said Dad had to be a pessimist, because the rain mightn't come, all the things that can go wrong on a farm.
Yeah.
And he says you've got to be careful you don't get your optimist and your pessimist wrong a little bit. And his little line was, because I appointed him as coach of Melbourne, and so I worked with him for a fair while and got to know each other well. And he was more on the pessimist than the optimist. I was more on the optimist than the pessimist. And his little line was, "I'm all up for that." He said, "But just make sure your parachute inspector, he's a pessimist. Just make sure he's the pessimist, And so I think there's you got to be able to do both. You've got to be able to play both roles. I think overly pessimistic people can go to blame, and blame is really, I think, toxic in regard to any form of growth, and because it gives you a reason not to do things, and it means that you blame the constraints rather than see the opportunities in the constraints, those types of things. But I'm probably more. I've always come from. I'm more on the optimistic side of the offering, and that goes to sort of belief and those other things that come with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I'm definitely in that camp myself. I think that you're only the second person on this podcast that has said that. Every other person has said no to that question I just asked about, is entrepreneurship for everyone? Interestingly, the other person who said no initially, and then stopped and said, "Well, actually, I think if you want it, you can learn it and train it, but you have to want it."
Yeah. That's the answer, I think. If you're not, but I think this is no different to anything, is it? Like if you want to, look, I've worked with CEOs who, and probably over a whole period of time, is bringing people through organisations and watching them grow in their organisations, and each of them reaching for the next level of what they consider to be, whether it's career path or ambition or growth, whatever it might have been.
Yeah.
We've all climbed a mountain, got to the top, and never liked the view. We've all done that, and so even what I learned from that is when I was taking people through and hopefully extending them and perhaps seeing opportunities and growth in them they hadn't quite seen in themselves, is giving them just enough understanding and insight that if you don't like it, you can go back. We'll leave it open for you to go back into, and that's not, sometimes that's difficult because you need to backfill the roles in regard to that. But it just seemed to me that if you'd overstretched on, once you actually had the experience of doing the work and then realising it wasn't for you, that it hadn't just cut off that option, it cut off the one you'd previously had. And if they come back with a sense of trust and optimism, they come back with the growth they've now got. Like even people who can, they might be quite judgmental of leaders who, they're working with and for, and then actually got to lead themselves. Well, they tended to be a little bit less judgmental in that way. And so they actually became better people within it. And, if like even say in footy at different times, I thought, well, I wouldn't have to be the CEO. Like there'd be I really enjoyed doing recruiting. I enjoyed being the footy person in that sense. And I'd be totally okay with that, but I would definitely have brought the insight of having played the role as I had, and the respect and the chat, because I think people can be very judgy of, whether they're senior coaches, whether they're CEOs, who are dealing with a role of which, they have minimal understanding of until you actually, you do wake up to your consequences each morning in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask you one final question, if you don't mind. Cameron, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I'm mindful of the fact that I've probably held you over time.
No, we're good as gold, mate. Good as gold. So, I enjoy it. As I said, I'm judging my currency of my existence is the conversations I get to have, and this is a ripper, so I'm good as gold.
I'm very appreciative, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it thus far. So if I could ask you this one, and I'll keep it to Design CEO specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If in the journey of starting up and continuing and heading into your Premiership quarter for Design CEO, if you could highlight, if you could pinpoint one part of that journey that you're most proud of, it might be difficult to do, but if there's one point you could say, this is a standout moment.
I think it's probably. I think it's mostly the recognition and understanding that you are having the most important conversations people can have as it relates to their work life, but often extending beyond that, because it's being a CEO is such an overwhelming role, and recognizing that there's an integrity in the relationship, but also an insight which they're getting, where you're the only person in their world that they can have this conversation with.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's not out of disrespect to other people, important people in their world, but because there's integrity embedded in the relationship clearly, and then you've got to support that over, through the trust built over time. But the insight is so valuable to them, but mostly as it relates to them finding their own insight, that there's just no one they can have this conversation with. Their partner maybe, will have the integrity thing, but wouldn't be able to tick all the insight. There might be people they can go to who have they're happy to give you advice, or they're happy to, but it ticks both those. And then just those moments where, someone leans forward and go, just so this has been the difference for me. I now know what I need to do, and I had no idea what I needed to do 25 minutes ago or an hour and a half ago, whatever it might have been. And there's been a number of examples of that, of which, you're driving home, and they're almost ones where you can't explain it to anyone else. You can't even, I'll go home and tell my wife, said, I had a great, my wife's a clinical psych, so she gets this sort of reward as well, in that way. And every so often I will say something and I go, I'll get to do that, at a much deeper level perhaps than what I do. I'll definitely at a much deeper level. And then there's just those moments where you can look down at a piece of work that you've produced and some little bloody, something goes off inside you. You go, that's a really nice piece of work, of which was that you've brought something into the world of which there was no before. There was no version of it before, at least to your knowledge. And for me, that mostly is when I get to combine the art and the story. Yeah. So it's a drawing with a piece of writing, and I go, I don't think anyone else was talking about footy. So I suppose it's a pretty weird combination when you think about it, but but it is unique. It's uniquely, yeah. And I'll see it, and I'm in the process at the moment of putting last year's drawings and stories into a book, and and I'm looking at it on my screen and going, this is nice. Yeah, this is going to come out really well. Yeah.
Making a positive impact. And actually, I think if most business owners felt they could make a positive impact, then the world would be a better place anyway, wouldn't it? So,
you almost have to think that a bit, don't you? I know that the positive impact might be putting your kids through school, but that again, it's just don't try to be a CEO if you're not prepared to meet it, where it needs to be met. Don't, because you're almost dishonouring it, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And if you're in a world where people are, there's a promise embedded in it in regard to either the product you're providing, the trust you built, or whatever it might be, that really to honour the role you need to do your best to deliver on whatever that promise in fact was. And I know often you'll fall short of that because one thing's just words on a piece of paper, the other thing's real in that way. But as long as it's as long as it knows you're trying, I think that's it's funny because I get this guy does some shirts for me, and he said, do you want to put something on the sleeve? And I was never going to do this. I didn't want to have my initials or anything like that. So I just get the word try put on this. It just got the words try. Okay. Yeah. So that's all you can do is just try. Yeah.
Keep trying. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Cameron Schwab, I'm going to thank you very much for your time and your insights and the conversation. We have spoken a couple of times previously outside, not doing this type of thing. So, but I've always enjoyed the conversation, and I'm very appreciative of the time. And thank you for being really generous, one of your G's, with your knowledge and your time.
No, thanks. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. I think you're doing great work, and it's just wonderful to be in your orbit.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care.
And that's all for this episode of Origin to Ambition. Thanks for tuning in. To make sure you don't miss our next conversation, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen in. For more information, you can visit us at dominiumcapital.com.au, and we'll see you next time.